Steel in retreat, the night America blinked. 100,000 tons of hardened steel, 2 nuclear reactors humming at full power, 90 of the deadliest aircraft ever built sitting wings folded on a flight deck the size of a small city. The full projection of American military will, and it's running, not repositioning, not maneuvering, running at flank speed into the open Indian Ocean, chased by a country that doesn't have a single aircraft carrier of its own. That is the image that broke through every classified briefing room, every Allied intelligence service, and every adversary's war planning cell in the first week of March 2026. And it is the image that Drake Vance, independent news analyst who breaks down complex stories for a general audience, refuses to soften or explain away. People keep reaching for words like redeployment and tactical repositioning, Vance says, his tone cutting through the usual diplomatic fog. Let's be honest about what we saw. An American carrier strike group was forced out of an operationally critical theater by an adversary who spent a fraction of what it cost just to fuel those ships. That is not a redeployment. That is a strategic defeat dressed up in Pentagon press release language. In this analysis, Vance walks through the full chronology of what happened in the waters of the Gulf of Oman, from the opening strikes of Operation Epic Fury to the Abraham Lincoln's hard sprint 800 nautical miles south, and explains why the consequences will reshape naval doctrine for the next generation. What really happened to the most expensive warship in human history? Why did the destroyers run out of bullets? And what does it mean for every future conflict when a $30,000 drone can hold a $3 billion vessel hostage? The answers are more uncomfortable than any press secretary is prepared to admit. Drop your thoughts in the comments below and hit that like button. It genuinely helps this kind of analysis reach people who need to hear it. We appreciate every single one of you. Now let's get into it. The trap Washington walked into? To understand the catastrophe in the Gulf of Oman, Vance argues, you have to start with the fundamental miscalculation that set it in motion. The Trump administration's decision to launch Operation Epic Fury in the final days of February 2026 was not impulsive. It was the product of what appeared, on paper, to be solid intelligence. According to Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth, American signals and human intelligence had confirmed that Iran was on the final approach to completing a functional nuclear warhead. A 10-day ultimatum demanding zero enrichment had been delivered and ignored. The window for a preemptive strike, the Pentagon argued, was closing. What followed was the most ambitious American air campaign in a decade. B-2 Spirit stealth bombers delivered 14 GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrators onto the hardened underground facilities at Fordow and Natanz in the opening hours. Within 24 hours, over 1,000 individual targets had been struck. Ministries in Tehran, air defense batteries in Isfahan, command nodes across the western provinces. American generals reported the confirmed destruction of approximately 90% of Iran's conventional air force. The operation, by every traditional metric, was performing exactly as designed. And that, Vance says, leaning into the irony, is precisely when things started going catastrophically wrong. Because Washington was measuring success using the wrong ruler. They were counting destroyed aircraft and cratered runways. Iran wasn't fighting that war. Iran had spent 15 years building a completely different one. The trap Tehran had constructed was architectural. Its foundation was radical decentralization, the deliberate elimination of any fixed asset that could be targeted by a precision munition. While American aircraft were burning expensive cruise missiles against static radar installations, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps had already activated what Vance calls the Ghost Fleet Protocol. Fleet elements, drone operators, ballistic missile crews, and fast attack boat units had departed major bases weeks before the first American aircraft crossed Iranian airspace. They had dispersed across hundreds of small anchorages, civilian fishing harbors, camouflaged warehouses, and pre-positioned sites cut into the coastal rock along the Persian and Omani shorelines. The assets that mattered most were never where the satellites said they'd be, Vance explains. The Iranians had been watching how the United States conducts pre-strike intelligence gathering for 30 years. They knew exactly which signatures to hide, which emissions to mask, and which facilities to sacrifice as decoys. Washington struck 1,000 targets, and in terms of actually degrading Iran's ability to wage the war they had planned, they hit maybe 100 of them. The operational centerpiece of Iran's counterstrike was designated Operation True Promise 4. Its logic was the inverse of conventional warfare doctrine. Rather than attempting to challenge American air superiority, a contest Iran could not win, Tehran's planners designed a campaign specifically engineered to exhaust the defensive systems of the naval strike group in the Gulf of Oman. The Abraham Lincoln and her escorts were not just military targets, they were the pressure point, the place where America's technological investment was most concentrated and most vulnerable to the arithmetic of asymmetric attrition. 5 March, the radar screens go white. The engagement that would define the entire campaign began at approximately 0300 local time on the 5th of March 2026. On the bridge of the USS Spruance and aboard the USS Stockdale, the two Arleigh Burke-class destroyers forming the forward air defense screen for the Abraham Lincoln, the watch officers experienced something that no simulation had fully prepared them for. The radar screens did not show 2 or 3 targets. They did not show a dozen. They showed hundreds, simultaneously, from multiple approach vectors, at multiple altitudes, at radically different speeds. Low-flying Shahed variant kamikaze drones skimming the wave tops at under 50 meters altitude to avoid early detection. Anti-ship cruise missiles threading through coastal terrain features at medium altitude, and arching down from the upper atmosphere. The unmistakable ballistic signature of Khalid Far's anti-ship ballistic missiles, entering their terminal phase at hypersonic velocities. I've spoken to people who were in comparable situations, Vance says quietly. Not this engagement, but exercises that approximated it. They describe the radar picture as something that stops making sense to the human brain. You're trained to track targets, prioritize threats, allocate interceptors. But when the picture fills up beyond a certain threshold, the cognitive load becomes paralyzing. You're not making tactical decisions anymore. You're just reacting. The tactics employed by the Revolutionary Guard were, in Vance's assessment, cynical, mathematically precise, and devastatingly effective. The first wave consisted of several hundred Shahed drones and their more advanced variants. Their purpose was not to sink anything. Their purpose was to force the destroyers to expend their interceptor inventory. Every RIM-66 or RIM-162 standard missile fired to neutralize a $50,000 drone represented a $2 to $4 million deduction from a finite magazine. The Phalanx close-in weapon systems spooled up and began their characteristic roar, filling the air around the ships with curtains of 20mm tungsten. But Phalanx is a last-ditch system. It cannot reliably intercept ballistic warheads on steep terminal trajectories. What the Iranians understood, Vance explains, is that the most powerful weapon they could field in this engagement wasn't a missile. It was the Mk-41 vertical launch system's reload cycle, or rather, the complete absence of one. You can't reload at sea. Once those cells are empty, the ship is essentially a target with propulsion. The entire first wave was specifically designed to drain the magazine so that the second wave, the one with the real warheads, would arrive at a ship with no meaningful defense left. The arithmetic was merciless. The destroyer's VLS cells were being depleted at a rate that bore no relationship to the cost of the threats they were intercepting. When Iranian ballistic missile operators confirmed through their sensor network that the destroyer's long-range air defense capacity was functionally exhausted, the second strike was ordered without delay. By mid-engagement, the Spruance had entered critical status. Unconfirmed reports from regional intelligence sources describe multiple drone impacts on superstructure elements, the disabling of several antenna arrays, and the partial loss of sensor systems essential to fleet-wide air defense coordination. The damage assessment remains a matter that the Pentagon has been, in Vance's words, unusually reluctant to discuss in any kind of forensic detail. The shield around the Abraham Lincoln was gone. What really happened to the Abraham Lincoln? The question that consumed the subsequent 3 days of global media coverage was deceptively simple. What actually happened to the carrier? The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps made no attempt at ambiguity in its public statements. Official Revolutionary Guard spokespeople claimed the Abraham Lincoln had sustained a minimum of 4 direct hits, 2 from low observable kamikaze drones and 2 from medium-range ballistic missiles. Social media platforms flooded with footage showing smoke columns rising from an area consistent with the carrier's last known position. The Pentagon went dark for over 12 hours. That silence told you everything, Vance says. The American military does not go quiet for 12 hours after a successful engagement. They go quiet when lawyers and communication staff are working very hard to find language that is technically accurate without being politically catastrophic. Commercial satellite imagery released in the days following the engagement failed to confirm catastrophic structural damage. No through-deck penetrations, no large-scale fires. But analysts noted significant anomalies. Unusual activity around the aft hull section and the Bortovier sponsony. Movement patterns inconsistent with normal flight operations. And then, most significantly of all, the maneuver itself. The prevailing expert hypothesis, which Vance finds entirely consistent with Iranian doctrine, centers on airburst detonation. If the warheads were configured to detonate several meters above the flight deck rather than on contact, the effect would not be a hull breach or flooding. The effect would be a devastating fragmentation pattern across the entire exposed deck surface, shredding F-35 airframes, destroying radar arrays, severing communication systems, and killing or wounding exposed personnel in a single second. The ship survives, but the ship becomes a floating platform with no meaningful combat capability. Here's the strategic genius of that approach, Vance says, and his tone takes on a kind of reluctant admiration. If you sink the carrier, you've committed an act of war that may trigger a response no one can control. If you blind it, cripple its air wing, destroy its sensors, and then demonstrate that you can do it again, you've achieved something far more valuable. You've made the carrier strategically irrelevant without giving Washington the clean casus belli of a sunken ship. Iran played that move with extraordinary sophistication. The Abraham Lincoln Strike Group did not simply shift position, it executed a hard sprint south, withdrawing over 800 nautical miles from the Iranian coastline, approximately 1,500 kilometers, into the relative safety of the deeper Indian Ocean. In American naval doctrine, this is the exit from the weapons engagement zone. To every observer outside the Pentagon's press office, it looked precisely like what it was. Flight. At that distance, the carrier's air wing could no longer strike targets in Iran without multiple aerial refueling operations, transforming every mission from a combat sortie into a logistical marathon. The weapon system designed to project lethal power from the adversary's front door was now operating from a different time zone. The carrier is not sunk, Vance says, but the doctrine that made it invincible. The doctrine that says you move it close, park it, and watch the other side capitulate. That doctrine is finished. Finished in the Persian Gulf, finished in the South China Sea, finished everywhere that a motivated adversary has had 15 years to study the playbook. The mosquito doctrine. Ancient logic, modern lethality. To understand the full depth of what Iran accomplished in the Gulf of Oman, Vance argues, it is essential to understand that nothing about it was improvised. The mosquito strategy, known in Western defense literature as anti-access/area denial, has been the cornerstone of Iranian military planning since the late 1990s. Every element of the engagement on the 5th of March was the product of patient, systematic, generational investment in a doctrine specifically designed around one question: how do you make an aircraft carrier a liability instead of an asset? The answer Iran developed has three interlocking components. The first is mass and disposability. Rather than competing with American naval construction by building expensive surface combatants, Tehran invested in thousands of fast attack craft armed with low observable anti-ship missiles and lightweight torpedoes. These vessels, small, fast, and operable from civilian infrastructure, can swarm from dozens of directions simultaneously. Against the radar systems of an Arleigh Burke destroyer already overwhelmed by drone contacts, a wave of fast boats against a background of coastal clutter presents a targeting problem that approaches the computationally intractable. The second component is the mobile launch platform. The static installations that American precision weapons destroyed in the opening hours of Epic Fury were, in many cases, intentionally sacrificed decoys. The real ballistic missile capacity, Zulfiqar systems mounted on standard commercial truck chassis, spent the days before the operation dispersing across a grid of pre-surveyed firing positions hidden in residential areas, agricultural land, and decommissioned industrial sites. In 2026, as Vance notes with characteristic bluntness, American smart bombs were hitting parking lots. Iranian ballistic missiles were hitting destroyers. The mobile missile problem is one of the genuinely unsolved challenges in modern warfare, Vance explains. You can destroy a missile silo. You can bomb a fixed launch facility. But when your adversary has 300 truck-mounted launchers scattered across a country the size of Western Europe, each moving every few hours, precision strike stops being a decisive instrument. It becomes an expensive game of whack-a-mole that your opponent has budgeted for, and you haven't. The third and perhaps most consequential component is surveillance architecture. Iran deployed deployed a distributed network of low-cost sensors across the Gulf of Oman, concealed on fishing vessels, anchored buoys, and unmanned surface craft. This network gave Tehran near real-time positional data on every American vessel in the theater. The Abraham Lincoln, one of the most expensive and technically sophisticated objects ever constructed, was operating in a maritime environment where its position, speed, and heading were known to the adversary at every moment. The hunter became the hunted, Vance says, and the hunter didn't know it until the first wave of drones appeared on the radar. That's not a tactical failure. That's an intelligence and doctrine failure of the first order. The math that broke the Pentagon. Behind the tactical drama of the engagement in the Gulf of Oman lies a financial and logistical reality that Vance argues is, in the long arc of this conflict, more consequential than any single military outcome. The numbers are not complicated. An Iranian Shahed kamikaze drone costs between $20,000 and $50,000 to produce. The standard missile interceptor required to reliably neutralize it costs between $2 and $4 million. The ratio of defensive expenditure to offensive threat ranges from 40-1 at its most conservative to 100-1 at its most extreme. Multiply that ratio across hundreds of drones per wave, across multiple waves per day, across the full operational timeline of the campaign, and the arithmetic becomes a strategic crisis. In the first 100 hours of Operation Epic Fury, analysts at the Center for Strategic and International Studies estimated total American munitions expenditure and operational costs at approximately $4 billion, nearly $1 billion per day. This figure existed in no defense authorization bill. It was not projected in any pre-campaign cost estimate, and it cannot be rapidly replenished. Modern interceptor missiles are not consumer electronics, Vance explains. They are precision-engineered objects with supply chains that span dozens of specialized facilities across multiple countries. The production cycle from contract to delivery runs between 1 and 2 years under optimal conditions. Iran can produce thousands of Shahed variants per month on industrial assembly lines that look, from the outside, like appliance factories. The asymmetry isn't just in the unit cost, it's in the replenishment rate, and that asymmetry compounds every single day this conflict continues. When the Spruance and Stockdale exhausted their Mk-41 cells in the opening engagement, they did not become less dangerous. They became useless. Two of the most capable surface combatants ever built, each representing decades of engineering and billions of dollars in investment, were reduced to steel hulls with engines and no meaningful contribution to fleet defense. The Abraham Lincoln's withdrawal was not only about protecting the ship from further attack, it was about stopping the hemorrhage of strategic munitions reserves that, once depleted, could not be replaced on any timeline relevant to the current conflict. Secretary Hegseth's description of the situation, deploying a Ferrari to intercept electric scooters, was more honest than I think he intended it to be, Vance says. Because the other half of that metaphor is the Ferrari runs out of fuel, the scooters keep coming, and then you have a very expensive piece of machinery sitting in the middle of the road and the scooters go around it. One drone costing $30,000, destroying a radar installation worth $300 million. A salvo of 100 drones costing $5 million total, draining interceptor missiles worth $400 million. This is the negative return on investment of modern asymmetric warfare, and it represents a challenge that no American defense budget has been structured to address. For the first time in the post-Cold War era, a superpower has discovered that its economic advantage does not translate into military endurance in a sustained attrition engagement against a resourceful, patient, and thoroughly prepared adversary. That, Vance says flatly, is the real story of the Gulf of Oman. Not the carrier, not the drones. The story is that America discovered it can be outspent in a war, and that is a discovery with consequences that go far beyond Iran. Washington in Zugzwang. The political dimensions of the crisis hit Washington with the force of the second strike wave. The Abraham Lincoln's withdrawal triggered an immediate cascade of consequences across the diplomatic, political, and alliance management dimensions of the conflict simultaneously. Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Kuwait found themselves absorbing Iranian retaliatory salvos, Shahed drones, and ballistic missile strikes against infrastructure and military installations that their air defense systems had not been adequately prepared for. Sources in diplomatic circles describe the Gulf monarchies as operating somewhere between furious and genuinely frightened. They had been brought into the operational orbit of a campaign on a timeline they did not control, and they were now paying the physical price for Washington's miscalculation. The incident in which Kuwaiti Air Defense Forces misidentified 3 American F-35 fighters as Iranian targets and engaged them, killing their pilots, introduced a dimension of friendly fire tragedy that complicated every subsequent diplomatic conversation. 3 American airmen dead at the hands of an ally's air defense system, in a theater that Washington had assured those same allies would be managed with precision and coordination. The operational reality told a different story. Donald Trump's public response was entirely consistent with his established political persona: aggressive, maximalist, and carefully decoupled from the operational facts on the ground. His social media assertions that Iran had been 90% destroyed, that its naval capacity had been eliminated, and that any offer to negotiate had been permanently foreclosed. "They want to talk," I said, too late. Played well to his domestic base and told every military planner in the theater something important. The commander-in-chief was operating from a political script that did not correspond to the intelligence picture. "This is the Zugzwang problem," Vance says, using the chess term for a position where every available move worsens your situation. Every option in front of the administration right now has a catastrophic downside. Ground intervention? You're looking at a land war in Iran, a country of 90 million people, mountainous terrain, and a population that, whatever they think of their government, will fight a foreign invasion. Continued air and sea attrition? You're burning through reserves at a rate that threatens your posture in every other theater simultaneously. Taiwan, the Black Sea, the Korean Peninsula. Negotiated settlement? Every adversary on Earth marks that down as confirmation that sustained pressure forces American concessions. The Pentagon's confirmation of at least 6 American service member deaths in the opening days of the operation sharpens the political pressure further. America's institutional appetite for protracted, expensive, and inconclusive military engagements has been demonstrably exhausted since at least 2011. The public tolerance for casualties in a conflict with unclear objectives and visible strategic reverses is narrow and shrinking. 3 scenarios for what comes next. Vance lays out 3 distinct trajectories for how the crisis resolves, and none of them are comfortable. The first scenario, the end of the monopoly on fear. The Abraham Lincoln may not have suffered a fatal structural wound, but it suffered something in many ways more consequential: a wound to the doctrine. The carrier's ability to function as an instrument of coercive diplomacy, to park near a coastline and communicate wordlessly the message that resistance is futile, depends entirely on the adversary believing it is invulnerable and irresistible. That belief has been destroyed. Not just for Iran, for every government that has been watching this engagement through satellite feeds and intelligence analysis. The signal received in Beijing, in Pyongyang, in Moscow, and in every other capital that has spent resources studying American military vulnerabilities is unambiguous. The carrier can be made to run. The era when its mere presence induced capitulation is finished. The second scenario, the war of slow financial strangulation. Operation Epic Fury burned through an estimated $6 billion in its first 100 hours. The high-precision arsenal that took decades and hundreds of billions of dollars to assemble is not a renewable resource on any timeline relevant to this conflict. As the Pentagon quietly shifts toward unguided munitions and gravity bombs to preserve its precision strike inventory, it is effectively acknowledging that the technological revolution in American warfare, the transformation inaugurated by the Gulf War in 1991, has encountered its economic ceiling. An adversary who simply needs to survive longer than the American magazine can sustain has already won a fundamental portion of the campaign. Iran has demonstrated it can survive. The question becomes whether Washington can sustain. The third scenario, the forced architecture of shared security. The administration is already, according to well-placed sources, exploring multilateral convoy escort arrangements for Gulf tanker traffic and attempting to construct a burden-sharing framework with NATO partners and regional allies. This represents something that no American administration since the end of the Cold War has been willing to formally acknowledge: that the United States cannot, alone, guarantee freedom of navigation in every contested maritime zone simultaneously. The new security architecture, if it emerges, will be more distributed, more dependent on Allied contributions, and structurally less dominated by American unilateral power. Whether that architecture can be built faster than the current crisis escalates is the operative question. The final verdict. Drake Vance does not traffic in false hope or diplomatic softening. His closing assessment of the Gulf of Oman crisis is delivered without qualification. What we witnessed in those waters is not an anomaly, and it is not a temporary setback caused by unusual circumstances. It is a proof of concept that will be studied, replicated, and improved upon by every adversary America faces for the next 50 years. Iran demonstrated that you do not need a navy to defeat a navy. You need drones, mobile missiles, a distributed sensor network, the willingness to absorb massive punishment, and the patience to wait for the mathematics to work in your favor. The carrier is still floating, but the doctrine that made it the decisive instrument of American power projection, that doctrine took a wound from which it will not recover unchanged. He pauses. The silence has weight. The genuinely dangerous moment isn't the one we just watched. The dangerous moment is 6 months from now, when the next adversary sits down with their general staff, watches the footage from the Gulf of Oman, and reaches the same conclusion that the Iranians proved out in practice, that the carrier can be made irrelevant without being sunk. When that conclusion is reached in enough capitals simultaneously, the entire strategic calculus of American power shifts. That is the real consequence of what happened on the 5th of March, 2026. And I don't think Washington is anywhere close to reckoning with it. Write your thoughts in the comments. Do you think this marks a permanent shift in naval power, or can American doctrine adapt fast enough to recover? Stay sharp, stay skeptical, and we'll see you in the next one.